everyone. On behalf of Tatya,
I'll just spotlight your video, Akash. Just hold on. So we have
yeah,
today's our session on mergers. The topic and the speaker will be introduced by Akash Singh. We have a recording of the session and it will be live streamed on YouTube as well. Over to you, Akash.
thank you, sir. Namaskar, everyone. On behalf of Tatya Walk the Law, I gleefully welcome everyone here who has joined us to be a part of what's going to be an illuminating session. On that note, I'd like to express our gratitude and welcome our speaker for today, Mr. Pavan Jhabak. Pavan sir handles insolvency matters before the National Company Law Tribunal and commercial disputes in the nature of civil suits and arbitration proceedings before the High Court. He specializes in advising, structuring, and executing various forms of corporate restructuring transactions, ranging from amalgamations, demergers, capital reductions, buyback, acquisitions, buyout, etc. He has also assisted and has been named in the credentials of the book Mergers and Takeovers by Pandian and Sridharan 2010 edition. It is truly an honor for Tatya to have you here among us today to conduct this session on corporate restructuring under the Companies Act and transaction through private contracts. Last but not the least, we also express our gratitude towards Advocate Manav Thomas, who assisted us in organizing this webinar today. Now, without any further delay, I sincerely invite Pavan sir to take over the session from here. Over to you, Pavan.
So today's session, everyone, is going to be in the format of an interview, so that it'll not be boring for all of you all. I hope so. That intrigues all of you all. In addition to the interesting topic that has been chosen for all of us today. So, Pawan, the first question for you is: what are mergers and acquisitions, and what are the transactions contemplated under the private agreements? I would just like to spotlight your video. Just kindly hold on. Yes,
Am I
Pawan.
audible?
Yes, you are.
Audible? Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure, to express my views here on the practice I've had for the last 10 years in this sphere of M&A. I sincerely thank Manav for giving me this opportunity, as well as Satya. It's a pleasure to share my experience to all of you. With respect to the question which Manav has put to me in terms of what are mergers and acquisitions and what are the transactions which can be contemplated on the private agreements. See, mergers and M&A is quite an exotic term. It ranges from various spheres of law. Okay. The bedrock principle governing all these transactions would be that you need to have a basic, strong understanding of company law. Now, with respect to what a merger is and what an amalgamation is, a merger and amalgamation is synonymous to a large extent. We use the word amalgamation because amalgamation is something which is defined under the Income Tax Act 1961. But amalgamation contemplates an amalgamation or a moving of business completely, the entire entity moving from one entity to another entity. Say, for example, A company is performing a certain business which wants to merge into B company. So, an amalgamation is purely straightforward lock, stock, barrel of movement of all the assets, all the liabilities from the transferor company to the transferee. This is a concept of amalgamation, which, though it is defined under the Income Tax Act, this is something which is not contractually done, but that's something which comes under Section 230 to 240 of the Companies Act 2013. Now, apart from an amalgamation, there are different forms of restructuring which the Companies Act throws up to us. If you just read Section 230 of the Companies Act, it's very interesting, wherein amalgamation is only one of the forms of a corporate restructuring exercise. Apart from that, you have something called the demerger. Demerger is a scenario wherein you have an identified undertaking. When you mean an undertaking, it is meaning assets corresponding with liabilities. Okay, an undertaking might be a hiving of a business. Say, for example, you perform 3 lines of business. Say, for example, automotive business. Say, for example, marketing businesses. Say, for example, spare part businesses. So you can identify a certain business within the company and move it to the entity which is consuming the business. So, in a sense, demerger does not involve closure of a company, it can only involve a movement of a certain business, whereas the company transferring the business and the company receiving the business would still continue to exist. Whereas in an amalgamation, it will be a scenario wherein one company will cease to exist. This is as far as an amalgamation and demerger is concerned. Apart from that, the Companies Act provides you a wide forum of compromises and arrangements.
I'd like to interrupt for a moment. Could you be a little more louder, Pawan, if possible? Just a
Yeah,
little more
yeah,
louder.
yeah. Is it better now?
Yes, yes, it is. It is.
Okay. So now, apart from amalgamation and demergers, there is also a concept of compromise or arrangement which parties can contemplate. Compromise or arrangement is simply basically an understanding between the company and its shareholders, which can be, variation of rights, which can be variation of terms of issuance of shares, which can be variation in terms of exit policies. There can be multiple ways in which an arrangement can be struck on between the company and its shareholders. That is also a form of corporate restructuring exercise which is available under the Companies Act. Apart from that, you have a compromise. Compromise is basically a sacrifice, most likely in a scenario wherein you would have creditors, okay, and the company entering into such kind of a corporate restructuring exercise, wherein, say, for example, you have a principal and interest payment of 100 rupees to a certain creditor, but then you can arrive at a compromise and get the blessing of the court of law, which is the National Company Law Tribunal, by approaching it under Section 230, by saying that this is an arrangement which I had with the creditor, but however, we've mutually agreed, or rather, you put this proposal up to the creditors by way of a compromise, wherein instead of 100 rupees, you propose to pay him 50 rupees or 75 rupees. This is another form of a restructuring exercise which is available under the Companies Act. Apart from that, you have schemes of reduction of capital, wherein you want to reduce the capital of a company. The reduction of a capital of a company can be for various multiple reasons. It can be for a reason wherein you are giving an exit to a shareholder, where you identify a certain set of shareholders whose shares you want to reduce. Apart from that, you can use the capital and the premium of the company to adjust it against the losses of the company. If you adjust it against the losses of the company, you have an advantage of a clearer balance sheet, a clearer P&L, which may enable further investments, which may enable further borrowing. So all these strategies, or rather all these mechanisms which are available under the Companies Act, it's something which will not fit in all scenarios. It has to be best in a case-based scenario wherein a company has a certain requirement. These are structuring mechanisms and exercises which are available under the Companies Act, okay, which now flew from 1913, subsumed into 1956, and now we have the 2013 Act. So under the 1956 Act, we had Section 391 to 394, which were most commonly used. Now we have Section 230 to 240, which is Chapter 15 of the Companies Act, which will give you an umbrella of restructuring options. Apart from that, in terms of private agreements, you can definitely have something called a slum sale agreement. Okay. A slum sale agreement is where you identify a certain business and lock, stock, barrel at a certain value, not an independent assigned value for each asset or each liability. Am I clear?
Yes, Pawan, you're clear.
Yeah. Can you proceed?
Moving to the second question, Pawan. What are the factors to be kept in mind before you complete a transaction, or while you contemplate such transactions of M&As? And how do you choose the route of restructuring? What is a particular route that you people choose while restructuring your company?
There are various factors which you have to keep in mind. There are several factors. There are tax implications which you have to keep in mind. You have creditor implications which you have to keep in mind. You have competition law issues which you have to keep in mind. You can have IPR issues which you have to keep in mind. All this is a framework of corporate law which you have to fit in this commercial exercise. So most of the dominant factors which determine a transaction is what the promoters want, what the investors want, what the creditors might want. Okay, these are the significant factors which you would have to consider while implementing or strategizing a transaction. So these are the reasons, or rather these are the circumstances under which it might be a need-based requirement wherein you would enter into a restructuring exercise.
Coming to the third aspect, what are the laws that you have to keep in mind? Like you said, the IP, the commercial laws. What are the specific provisions of each law that you'll have to keep in mind before entering into such transactions? And what does the role of strategy plan play in a transaction? Is strategy really that important in an M&A?
Significantly, what has to be kept in mind when you're entering into a transaction is, one, you would obviously want to understand what the commercial understanding between the parties are. What do they want to achieve? There might be situations wherein you would want to consolidate a business to achieve a certain objective. There might be a certain situation wherein you would want to consolidate a business to achieve reduction of cost, uh, efficient administrative running of business. There might be several reasons. So these are reasons which are put down in a scheme wherein we have to justify to a court of law, which is the tribunal, as to why we are doing a transaction. Apart from that, there might be situations wherein you have under the Income Tax Act, we have Section 72A, which says that you have a period for which you can carry forward losses. There might be scenarios wherein mergers might happen or demergers might happen for the purposes of for the purpose of carrying forward these losses, because this has a lease period of 8 years. So you might want to renew this lease period. So there are several factors. Apart from what regulations are, apart from that, it's completely driven as to what the promoters want and whether the investors want an exit. So it is completely purely commercial, which has to be synced with the law available in the country. And strategy plays a significant role in determining a transaction, because, say, for example, you would want to give a certain shareholder an exit. So if a promoter does a transfer of shares, technically the money goes from the promoter's pocket to the exiting investor. So there might be a scenario where the promoter might not have funds in the company, or funds with him, but he would have funds in the company. So you might opt for a reduction of capital. So strategy is essential, because you have to culminate that with the income tax laws, with the stamp duty laws. So strategy is essential. But though the process might be mundane by way of a contract or by through a rigorous mechanism under 230 to 240, but a lot of strategy goes into deciding what commercial restructuring you would want to adopt.
Moving to the next question, Pawan. Could you please enlighten on, can transactions be retrospective and or they are only prospective? What's the relevance that you could enlighten us on this aspect?
So every court scheme, which you normally do under Section 232 to 240, has a certain concept called the appointed date. Appointed date is basically, it can be, say, for example, we are in August 2020, but you can implement a transaction with an appointed date of April 1st, 2019. The significance of identifying a date is essential, because, say, for example, you determine an amalgamation which you're filing today with an appointed date of April 1st, 2019. The object you would achieve is that though you have past the financial year of 31st March 2020, you would be able to consolidate the business in the financial year 1920. So everything moves on the date of transfer. Everything moves on the date of the appointed date. It is essential. It is extremely essential, because that is determined as per case law to be the date on which you will identify the asset and liability which you're proposing to transfer or which you're proposing to purchase. And valuations with respect to every transaction also gets determined by virtue of this particular date. Schemes might have an appointed date concept, but private agreements might have something like a date of transfer, something like a date of a date of implementation of transfer. You will have various definitions or an effective date in private agreements. So it's quintessential to every transaction you enter. It can be prospective too. The law is very clear as far as the Companies Act is concerned, where you can have forecasted and prospective dates for which you want to consummate the transaction. So I think it's a starter for every transaction, which is very important.
Moving to the next question, Pawan. Could you please give us a brief glimpse of how transactions work in court and through bilateral agreements? So, is there a detailed procedure entailed in the code?
Yeah, as far as court schemes are concerned, which might be an amalgamation, might be a demerger or a compromise or an arrangement, it's mandatory under law that you have to go through the process under 230.
लैपटॉप कहाँ है?
Pardon?
अरे वो कॉल चालू.
So it's mandatory that you have to go through the process of section 230 to 240. So with respect to section 230 to 240, you have to go through the process of section 230 where you have a specifically appointed tribunal, which is called the National Company Law Tribunal, which takes up these cases, wherein it's a process where all the stakeholders, meaning the creditors and the shareholders, have to consent to the entire process, either by way of affidavits or the court will call
I
a
may
meeting.
interrupt for a moment. Pawan, how was the procedure and manner of working when the CLB, when NCLT was not there? Could you please enlighten on that as well when you're referring to courts? How was it before the NCLT?
Before the NCLT, there's a three-stage procedure. The three-stage procedure is, one is the application stage, one is the petition stage, and one is the final hearing stage. In terms of the procedure, the application would basically call for a meeting of shareholders, creditors, or ask for a dispensation if you have a consent of them, and notices will be issued to the regulators.
Referring to the situation when the NCLT was not established. In such a situation, how were mergers and
I can't hear you.
Before NCLTs were established, could you please enlighten on how the mergers took place at that point in time?
So we had the Companies Act 1950. Yeah, I've understood. So you're saying before the NCLT, how did transactions go through in court? You had Companies Act 1956, which conferred power to the High Court of the jurisdictional company. Say, for example, if your registered offices in Chennai, so your jurisdictional High Court will be the Madras High Court. So from 1913 till 2020, we had the Companies Act, conferring jurisdiction to a certain court of law. Where under 1956 Act, from 1956 till December 2016, we had the High Court of the jurisdictional registered office, which will determine an M&A transaction. Now it's before the NCLT because through the judgment of R. Gandhi versus Union of India, the tribunals were established and they are specifically assigned with technical members as well as judicial members to screen the process of an amalgamation, which is more of a cumbersome process today because regulators have a say. There's a detailed rationale which you have to put across the court. Valuations are questioned. So it was easier before the High Court. It's more of a challenge before the NCLT.
Moving to the next aspect of what are the transactions which parties contemplate during this pandemic of COVID-19? What do you see is happening in the transaction market? Do you see mergers actually taking place, or do you see a sink in the graph of the work regarding mergers and acquisitions?
Okay, based on my practice in the last 6 months, the transaction work has not come down. M&A is going full speed, in full steam. Transactions which are pending before COVID-19 are bound by timelines in terms of bringing in money into the company, bringing in money in investments into the country. So M&A work is not reduced for pre-COVID transactions. As far as post-COVID impact is concerned, I definitely believe that, and this is the sense of the entire M&A market. I'm talking about the big fours who I speak to, who contemplate transaction. There are multiple proposals for restructuring exercises because there has to be a mechanism wherein a company which has not done this for 3 to 6 months, whose business and revenue streams have dwindled. Okay, how would they neutralize this in the balance sheet? How will they neutralize this, in terms of telling their stakeholders that you will not get any dividend this year? So there are various restructuring exercises wherein, parties are contemplating wiping off losses. The parties are contemplating streamlining of balance sheets because they've absorbed these losses. They might not be active today or filing today, but definitely in the course of the next 6 months, because they have to do something for the impact as far as the financial year 20 to 21 is concerned. Until and unless it gets over, the pandemic gets over, you would actually not know how deep the hole is. Apart from that, in terms of sustainability of independent businesses, I think there's going to be a fire sale. I think private transactions are going to be huge. People who have deep pockets would survive in terms of if they had any reserves or if they had any, because you have virtually all businesses having moratoriums granted by the RBI. Once it's only till August 31st, 2020. So once that goes off, that's when you will actually realize the impact of how a business will be able to survive, and they might decide to sell. So I think M&A is on the up. Might be acquisitions, might be any forms of restructuring. And as of today, also, there's no stoppage of work. And there are people who are bullish also.
Moving to the next aspect, does cross-border mergers take place as on date under the framework of the current act? And did cross-border mergers take place in the framework of the previous act as well?
As far as that's a very good question, because there was a restriction under the old act wherein companies could merge from abroad, provided that local jurisdictional law permitting them to merge with a foreign company. There could be only an inbound merger which could happen. So, for example, a company based in Mauritius, say, for example, a company based in any other jurisdiction which permits a foreign merger could merge into the Indian company. But however, what has happened under the new act is that there's a certain provision called Section 234, which has come in, which permits inbound and outbound mergers. Okay, your question is very relevant because I would also like to highlight a point wherein Section 234 is permitting only mergers as per certain judgments. There are certain judgments which are passed by the NCLT in the year of 2019, where they disapproved foreign demergers. Yes, you have to go through an elaborate process of law where you have to get a previous permission of the RBI. But yes, there is inbound and outbound mergers alone which are permitted today as per the prevalent case laws available. But I think that's subject to interpretation and something which will be overturned. I believe there can be a demerger as well as a merger possible under the Indian law today, which can be inbound as well as outbound, subject to RBI regulations and RBI permissions.
On the next aspect, could you enlighten us on the stamp duty implications on these transactions that we are referring to?
That's also that's what how do I put this to you? This is something which is the one of the most important factors where parties determine whether to go ahead with a transaction or not. Say, for example, you're executing a business transfer agreement or you're executing a slum sale agreement. If I understand, the stamp duty implications are larger, whereas under the scheme, if you do it through a court process, through an NCLT process, there is a separate entry which is given for court schemes and court orders. That's something which is a significant factor which parties think about, because the outlay of cost is immense. It's significant in terms of the transaction, because if I give you an example of Tamil Nadu specifies that if a merger or a demerger contemplates a transfer of an immovable property, you would have to pay 2% on the transaction going through, or 0.6% of the consideration. So stamp duty implication is large. Stamp duty implications are a challenge because sometimes laws are uncertain, because they might contemplate only the words merger or an amalgamation, but might not contemplate a demerger. So stamp duty implications are significant in terms of costs, which a party negotiates before entering into a transaction. If it's very burdensome, I think parties mutually share to burden such costs, which might be factored into the consideration or share allotment, which might happen. But yes, it's a very good question where stamp duty is sink or non. It's paramount apart from income tax.
Is there some percentage that stamp duty amounts to on the entire transaction? Is there some percentage? Is there some specific percentage that we can come down to approximately to say that stamp duty will be this much?
Yeah, say for example, if you see the Bombay Stamp Act, I'm subject to correction. Stamp duty implications arise when you have a transfer of immovable property as a part of the company. As far as Bombay is concerned, there's a Bombay Stamp Act. I think there's a cap on how much you would pay. I think it's 25 crore, which irrespective of how much value of the property is, you would cap it at 25 crore. So there are percentages specified for each state. Tamil Nadu has a certain percentage, which is 2% of the transfer of property happening
I think there was a small network
Yeah.
issue. Yes, he's back. Yeah. Moving to the next aspect. What is the role of regulators pre and post these transactions? Do they have any role to play?
Regulators did not have much of a role to play under the old act, which is the 1956 Act, wherein you would have only the Ministry of Corporate Affairs or the Office of the Official Liquidator, which would have locus to even speak on a scheme. But the laws evolved, the laws developed. There are specific provisions under the Companies Act 2013 which mandate notices to go to all regulators, which might be the regional director, official liquidator, the income tax department. Say, for example, you're in the airline business. Okay, you would have to issue notices to those particular sectoral regulators. Say, for example, you're in the mobile business and you're doing a transaction like that, which is in the nature of an amalgamation. So notices would go to try. So the roles of the regulator is significant. But what has to be considered here is that it's very important to read the bylaws when these licenses are issued for each business, because certain licenses contemplate only post facto approval. There are certain licenses which contemplate a pre-facto approval or other pre-approval before going in for an amalgamation. For example, you have the Competition Act. The Competition Act specifies a certain threshold wherein if your combination in terms of turnover or asset size reaches a certain threshold, then you will have to have a prerequisite approval. So, for example, you're a listed company. If you're a listed company under the LODR regulations or your listing agreement, it's mandatory for you to approval with the stock exchange as well as SEBI. So these are that. So there are roles played by regulators pre-filing of this transaction. There are regulators who play a role even post-filing of this transaction. So irrespective of the nature of the transaction you're entering into, regulators play a significant role in governing the transaction. Most of it are post-facto approvals. Say, for example, you have a factory license. Say, for example, you have IP transfer. Say, you have other, licenses which you might have. You have licenses under the Shop and Establishments Act. You have other licenses under labor law. You have PF, all that. That is something which is post-facto, wherein by virtue of the order passed by a court, it would have, the power of a vesting order, wherein these licenses vest, but that does not mean that you don't go before these regulators. You might go before these regulators to intimate them and register into a new company's name. But yes, there is a very good question wherein the significant role more than ever to be paid by the regulators.
Moving on to the next question, Pawan, could you enlighten us with under the restructuring which is done under these resolution plans? What is to be taken in and to be kept in mind when the corporate debtors are undergoing liquidation? And also, are these resolution plans different in M&A and for the RP?
Manav, your voice is feeble. Can you repeat it again?
Am I audible now to you, Pawan? Am I audible now to you?
Yeah, better.
Yeah, so how does restructuring work under resolution plans? And in these restructuring progresses, what do you do when the corporate debtors are undergoing the liquidation process under the IBC?
So this is something which is a developing law. We all know the IBC, which has come in only in 2016. So there are different stages and processes of an IBC. Say, for example, a company has gone into a resolution process. So resolution plans might contemplate various mechanisms, and one of it might be an amalgamation or any form of restructuring provided under Companies Act. The reason why this is important is because by virtue of an order passed by the adjudicating authority, which is no one else other than the NCLT, it dispenses with significant processes which you would independently have to do if you are going. So it's very important to understand that if you take into consideration any corporate restructuring exercise under a resolution plan, which might be contemplated during the course of the resolution plan, might not be an immediate action, might be in 6 months, might be in 1 year. There are orders which are passed where resolution plans have approved amalgamations even through an order of a resolution plan, wherein this is absurd because a resolution plan does not, or rather the IBC does not give powers which a court has under the Companies Act 2013. But there are orders like this which are passed. But the most conservative view which you can put as far as the resolution plan is concerned is that apart from you getting an approval of a resolution plan, you would still have to do an independent process under the Companies Act. That's a gray area. That's a gray area where there are not many judgments on this point. It's an evolving stream which is very important to take note of. Everyone thought that amalgamations are only for going concerns or companies are under a resolution process, but something which is broken loose is when companies under liquidation. There are significant schemes wherein various judgments have been passed by the high courts, by the NCLAT, by the NCLT, that if a company is not successful in its resolution process and is pushed into a liquidation, the first step which the liquidator has to do is to attempt a corporate restructuring. It's become a rule of law, wherein liquidation also you would have to exhaust a remedy and if of a corporate restructuring under a Companies Act, and only if that fails will the liquidator then sell assets of the company and then pay off its creditors. It's a significant area of law and practice which is growing today. Law is unclear as to how the process should be adopted. There are arguments made by people that independent of you being in a liquidation process or the resolution process, you have to comply with the Companies Act. There are arguments taken by people that I don't need to comply everything under the Companies Act because I'm under liquidation and I know there are certain special privileges given to me. I need not go through the entire cumbersome process under 230. So it's a debate which is still going on. It's being argued in various forums, but yes, it's a huge area of work. As far as resolution plans, restructurings are concerned, as well as restructurings when liquidation is concerned. It's an unexplored area of law which is going to gain real speed in the coming years. Manav, you there?
Moving to the next aspect. Am I audible to you now, Pawan? Is it much clearer? I hope it is. What are the drawbacks in the present system to implement transactions, and where do you see are those roadblocks and those hindrances which needs correction by virtue of an amendment or by virtue of some other interpretation of laws?
So as far as the scheme why the 2013 Act was introduced and why specific power was given to the NCLT, because they made it exclusive that a certain forum is there for a relief of such nature. But unfortunately, the process is not as liberated as it seems. Wherein if you compare to global jurisdictions, you actually need not need a court process. A court process is done away with. You have contractual mergers which happen. So basically parties enter into a contract like normal bilateral agreements, file it with the registrar of companies, and the merger takes effective. So it's just how fast you negotiate and thrash out a bilateral agreement and you file it and the merger is effective. But whereas as far as India is concerned, you have to go through a step-by-step process. Apart from that, you have to Ministry of Corporate Affairs, to the regional director to decide small company schemes. So it's a laborious process in terms of timelines, because what has to be understood is that this is something which is done in genuine economic interest. Commercial interest is not keeping the transaction lagging for a year or 6 months. That might not be viable. So I think if there are processes done away with in terms of how you might take in a pre-approval from the regulator and just file it with the ROC rather than going through a court process. Yes, it would damage the practice for a corporate professional like me, but it would actually smoothen the process and your advisory role would still continue. So I think something which might be to speed the process up, that might be relevant as far as the court process is concerned. But apart from that, if you have granting stamp duty laws, certain income tax benefits which might be granted to transactions, certain waivers which might be granted, like how you have startups which have significant schemes given by the government of India. So that might give incentive to push these transactions through. So I think on a legislative front, a faster process, and on an economic front, if you have liberation schemes given to these parties, FEMA laws be not restrictive. So maybe that can be a definite step forward.
But don't you think, Pawan, in this aspect, when you do away with this court procedures, don't you think there won't be checks and balances? For the purpose of checks and balances alone, this approval from the NCLT has been introduced. Don't you think that checks and balances are required? And if we do away with that, there'll be some various other issues that would plague the companies in future.
It's a very good question you put. But if you go by what law has been laid down by the Supreme Court in the case of Mihir H. Mafatlal, it said that a court, when they are examining a scheme, would not be right for them to delve into a commercial decision taken by the stakeholders. And it also says that the court in a scheme only plays a role of an umpire. Okay, so in a sense, the laws evolve in such a way wherein the interference of the court is to the least. Yes, you have checks and balances, because checks and balances are not only because of a transaction taking place. Respective of a transaction taking place, there are governance measures which are introduced under the Companies Act, under the Income Tax Act, which are still prevalent today. It has to be balanced out. There has to be a mechanism wherein you would want, a quicker and faster window for an approval or a pre-approval before going to court, wherein you have a regulator having a say. Even today, if you see, if schemes are objected by the Income Tax Act, okay, and saying that the scheme might be a device, the scheme might be evasive of tax, courts have significantly held that the Income Tax Department has no jurisdiction. If they have an objection, or rather, if they believe that tax is escaped their hands, they would bring it up during the assessment process. So it would not, in my view, reduce the role of regulators or introspection. There definitely has to be a check and balance system, which is anyways existing. So just because a transaction is consummated, it does not mean a tax regulator loses its right. Say, for example, if you have the Vodafone case, the transaction went through. It's one of the most celebrated judgments on investments and jurisdiction, wherein significant tax implications were imposed. But yes, that was after the transaction took place. So it doesn't mean that the regulators do not have a locus or a right even post the transaction. But yes, there has to be a mechanism which we would have to follow worldwide as to what countries are doing in the US or the UK in how they implement faster transactions, because that's the need of the hour. We cannot wait, for a laborious process or a time-consuming process.
Moving on to the last question before we open the session for a Q&A from all the participants. Could you please enlighten how do regulators and tribunals view these transactions, and are there any practical problems that the companies face and the practicing advocates and face?
In terms of practical problems, might be, though you have the tribunal, which has been, I come back to the tribunal again, because the idea of the tribunal was to effectively complete the mechanism. It's poorly burdened in terms of staff, in terms of infrastructure. Yes, now we have various benches coming up. We have a bench in Kochi, which has come up 6 months back, which is significant because otherwise everything used to come to Tamil Nadu. Okay, so I think judicial challenges are large. Say, for example, if you have something called the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal. So if I had to go on appeal, I had to go all the way to Delhi because that was the only jurisdiction wherein I could file an appeal if my scheme is rejected. But now, by virtue of the Swiss Ribbons case, we have a tribunal, an appellate tribunal coming to Chennai for the southern states. So I think these measures are significant. It helps a litigant because at least for the south zones, access to courts are easier if you have a tribunal which is closer. Otherwise, we would have to go to Delhi to file all our appeals. That's something which is significant. Apart from that, practical problems, I think there are significant problems faced by parties post a transaction. Mergers are something which is actually a merging of balance sheets, or demergers are something which is, demerging of balance sheets. But when you implement these transactions, there are significant problems faced in terms of regulator interferences. Say, for example, you have a factory license. There might be the commissioner who's saying that I'm not going to recognize your scheme. Then how do you implement it? Then you have to go through court. You might have to file a writ petition. So if there is a change in law brought into all these economic legislations, labor legislations, tax legislations, indirect tax legislation, which recognizes credit, or say, for example, you have a TDS credit, which you're not able to gain pursuant to the merger, you would end up filing a writ petition. So I think mechanisms like that would be helpful. Clarity in stamp duty laws will be significant. That is significant practical challenges which parties face while implementing a transaction.
Thank you so much, Pawan, for enlightening us in just a span of 30 to 40 minutes on so many various aspects on M&A. Me being a practitioner, I really like. Me being a litigation practitioner, I'm not much in touch with M&A. So it was really a delight to hear you. So I request all the participants, if any one of you all have any queries, you all can either raise your hands or key in your questions in the chat, and I shall read them out to the speaker. So anyone, you all have queries, starting with Anirudh. Yes, Anirudh. Okay. Are there any other queries? There was an aspect regarding the no objection certificate that needs to be procured while proceeding for an M&A. Could you please enlighten us on that, Pawan? That was one question by one of the participants.
Okay. No objection certificate, I understand, might be from a regulator or from a creditor too. So there are certain. So if you're a listed company, you mandatorily have to obtain an approval from the stock exchange as well as the SEBI, which you have to obtain. Apart from that, say for example, you're an NBFC merging. There are bylaws which prescribe that you have to go to the RBI and take a no objection first. So there are certain specific regulators like the RBI, SEBI, which require a pre-approval for any transaction which might go through. Okay. Apart from that, in terms of no objection from stakeholders, normally the court has evolved to accept, consent affidavits filed by shareholders connected to the company, which can be taken on record. You have class of creditors, which might be either a secured creditor or an unsecured creditor, who can give us consent or a no objection to the scheme by way of an affidavit. So these are the stakeholders who you essentially take consents from, which are relevant. I hope I've answered that.
Do we have any other queries for the speaker? So one personal question from my, yes, please.
So good evening, sir. It was very wonderful an experience, and I'm delighted to have you here. I have a question, like once we going for the merger with any enterprises, what shall we look into the aspects like in equity value or the enterprise value, like the turnover of that company?
Okay. You're basically determining, basically asking the question as to how do you determine a valuation
Yes,
into a
sir.
scheme.
Yes, sir.
Correct? That's more of a domain wherein the Companies Act specifies that a valuation exercise has to be determined by a registered valuer. A registered valuer, there are separate regulations framed by them. So any valuation which is done under the Companies Act for any Companies Act purpose, you would have to obtain the certificate from a registered valuer. Now, in terms of having the valuation done, there are different ways in which you could enter into a valuation. The accounting treatments for a scheme talk about a fair value transfer or a book value transfer. So you might have an NAV method, you might have as you said, that enterprise value method. It completely depends upon a commercial understanding between the parties. What is essential for you to understand is that the amalgamation of the demerger does not contemplate any cash consideration. Okay, it does not have a cash consideration. It has more of a share consideration. The reason why shares are issued in an amalgamation, if you read any amalgamation or demerger scheme online, you would always see that shares issued. The reason why shares are issued is to have tax neutrality to a scheme. because a scheme of amalgamation or a scheme of demerger will not have tax implications or capital gain implications if you follow the provisions of the Income Tax Act. So it is purely driven on what accounting treatment you're adopting in a scheme. It's more of a domain which a chartered accountant exercises. Mostly in schemes, it is only a book value transfer which is made. And rarely do you see a fair value transfer. When there is a fair value transfer, a fair value is arrived vis-a-vis each company and a share exchange ratio is fixed. There is no cash transaction which is involved in a scheme most of the time. But if there is a cash transaction involved, it will be subject to capital gain tax.
Moving to the
Thank
next
you.
question by Mr. Arvind. So he says that there are a lot of notifications by SEBI and RBI owing to the ongoing pandemic. Most importantly, the IBC provisions have been suspended for a period of 6 months with regard to COVID-related debts. So he has two queries in this background. One is, what is your take on the impact of the pandemic on mergers and acquisitions? I believe you have already covered this in the session. The second question, however, is how would you think it would affect the valuation of businesses?
In terms of deciding a valuation, or rather in terms of deciding what would be the value of a sale of business, okay, not only would you, yes, the COVID pandemic will affect the revenue streams, but it does not mean that a business has lost potential. Yes, a business today has lost income, it has lost revenue, but it can never be said that this business does not have potential. So I don't think there will be a drop in valuations. I think valuation on forecasting basis will be something which will be looked up to. But what would be very important to consider is companies which are virtually going dead today. Though they might have potential, you might have investors and buyers who would want to squeeze out a deal. So in that scenario, wherein a promoter has to sell for the sake of survival, yeah, that time I think valuation might be impacted, but I don't think there will be impact in valuations as such, because the potential of the business is never going to be lost, because there are going to be innovative ways and potential ways to rev up the business even today.
Thank you so much, Pawan, for those answering your, giving your time out of your busy schedule and conducting this session. We are very grateful to you, Pawan. We hope to have many more sessions on corporate law in the days to come, because the pandemic doesn't seem to leave us anywhere in the near future, is what we get news from the WHO. We are also delighted to have Honorable Retired Judge, District Judge Malyadri sir on today's call. Thank you, sir, for joining today's call. I hope to see you, sir, again in the calls that we are scheduling during these times. If anyone has any further queries on today's session, please feel free to contact me, and we can definitely revert back to the queries by getting in touch with our speaker. So thank you again, Pawan, and thank you everyone for joining today's session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a pleasant evening, all of you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would also like to thank Tatya for hosting this session. Without Tatya, I don't think it would have been possible for us to take this forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much.